The rain hammered against the cold marble pillars of the Udu estate, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the hollow silence within its walls. Christopher Udu, a man whose name was synonymous with Nigeria's most sprawling real estate empires, sat motionless in a velvet armchair, his frame looking smaller than his reputation. He wasn't dressed in the bespoke Italian suits that graced business magazine covers. Instead, he wore a simple worn robe, his eyes fixed on a silver-framed photograph of his wedding day. His face, a map of hard-won power and pride, was now etched with a profound, quiet confusion. On paper, he was the victor. He had the billions. He had the legacy. He had a family. Yet, as he looked around the cavernous living room, he was struck by a single terrifying thought. None of this is real. His wife, Gladdys, was a master of the performative smile, but it only reached her eyes when a new diamond reflected in them. His daughter, Sandra, treated his presence like a bank teller's, only visiting when her lifestyle in France demanded a fresh wire transfer. His son, Alex, spoke to him in spreadsheets and profit margins, never once asking how his father's heart was beating. Tonight, however, the fake life Christopher had built didn't just feel hollow, it felt dangerous. He had just come from a secret consultation with Dr. Gabriel. The report was glowing. He was in perfect health. But as he had walked through the hospital corridor to leave, he caught the sound of a familiar melodic laugh echoing from behind a half-closed door. It was Gladdys. He paused, expecting to hear her praying for him. Instead, he heard the words that would burn his world to the ground. If this man finally dies now, I swear, my real life will start. If you are just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you are watching from in the comments section. The news of Christopher Udu's sudden cardiac arrest rippled through the nation like a seismic shock, dominating every news cycle and social media feed. From the high-rise offices in Lagos to the bustling markets of Onitsha, people mourned the fall of a real estate giant, their screens filled with black and white tributes to a man they believed was gone forever. Outside the iron-wrought gates of the Udu estate, a sea of cameras and weeping strangers gathered, but the heavy curtains of the mansion remained drawn, shielding a reality that was far from somber. Inside the master suite, the air was thick with the scent of expensive French perfume and the upbeat rhythm of a song playing softly on a gold-plated speaker. Gladdys Udu stood before her vanity, her reflection showing a woman who looked more like a bride than a widow. With a steady hand, she traced her lips with a bold, defiant shade of red lipstick, the color of blood and victory. Her best friend, Julie, leaned against the velvet bedpost, watching with a mixture of awe and caution as Gladdys adjusted her black lace wrapper, not for modesty but for style. Gladdys, the press is literally outside crying for him, Julie whispered, glancing toward the window. Are you sure you want to look this vibrant? Gladdys scoffed, blotting her lips and turning to flash a smile that never reached her eyes. Let them cry, Julie. They didn't spend 20 years trapped in this golden cage with a man who prioritized land deeds over his own wife. Christopher provided the money, yes, but he forgot to provide a life worth living. She picked up a crystal glass filled with vintage champagne, held it aloft, and clinked it against the air. Tonight, we aren't mourning a death. We are celebrating a birth. This isn't a funeral, it's my freedom party. Julie raised her own glass, the bubbles catching the light. To the queen of the Udu Empire, finally wearing her crown. Gladdys took a slow, deliberate sip, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a woman who had finally found the key to her shackles. Little did she know, hidden behind the ornate molding of the ceiling, a tiny lens was capturing every smirk, every drop of champagne, and every word of her betrayal. Miles away in a dim room in Imo State, Christopher Udu sat in the shadows, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a monitor. As he watched his wife toast to his demise, his heart, which the world thought had stopped, grew harder than the stone pillars of the house he had built for her. The shadows in the small, cramped room in Imo State seemed to press in on Christopher, but his eyes never wavered from the glowing wall of monitors. The high-definition feeds from his mansion provided a front-row seat to a play he never wished to see, casting a cold blue light over his hardened features. He watched as the heavy doors of his private study, a room once treated with hushed reverence, were pushed open by his financial director, Morris. Gladdys was already there, her red lips curved into a predatory smile as she leaned against Christopher's mahogany desk. Morris did not look like a man mourning his employer. He moved with the practiced ease of a successor. He poured 2 glasses of Christopher's finest cognac, handing one to Gladdys with a look of shared triumph. "To new beginnings," Morris murmured, the crystal clinking with a sound that felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Gladdys laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed through the hidden speakers in Imo State, as she replied, "To freedom, my darling." Christopher's grip tightened on the edge of his chair as the camera feed shifted to his daughter's bedroom. Sandra was not weeping, she was working. The bed was strewn with his most prized possessions, the vintage Patek Philippe, the limited edition gold coins, and his antique Rolex. With the clinical efficiency of a pawnshop owner, she held the Rolex up to her ring light, snapping high-resolution photos for an elite underground auction site. Christopher watched her thumbs fly across the screen of her phone, typing out a description that reduced his lifetime of achievements to a mere transaction. "Authentic vintage, belonging to the late billionaire," she muttered to herself, her eyes gleaming not with tears, but with the calculated greed of a digital scavenger. She wasn't looking for a legacy. She was looking for a crypto transfer that his lawyers couldn't track. Christopher sat in the silence of his hiding place, a ghost witnessing the dismantling of his life. He saw clearly now that his death was not a tragedy to them, it was a jackpot. The man they had called husband and father was already being erased, replaced by the cold, hard currency of their unchecked ambition. By the 3rd day of the deception, the atmosphere within the Udo mansion had shifted from artificial mourning to a frantic, feeding frenzy of greed. The heavy scent of lilies had been replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of ambition as the living began to tear at the remains of the empire while the body was not yet cold. Christopher sat in the suffocating stillness of his room in Imo State, his eyes fixed on the screen as his wife, Gladdys, paced the length of his private study like a caged predator. She wasn't pacing in grief. She was waiting for Mr. Rubin, the family's insurance agent, who sat across from her with a folder that held the price of Christopher's life. Gladdys leaned over the desk, her black lace sleeves fluttering like the wings of a crow. "900 million, Mr. Rubin," she said, her voice dropping to a low, demanding hiss. "The policy is clear. I am the sole beneficiary, and I expect the funds to be liquid within 48 hours. Rubin adjusted his glasses, his hands visibly shaking under her intense gaze. "Madam Gladdys, the funeral was only yesterday. Standard verification protocol usually takes weeks. We need to finalize the death certificate and verify the cardiac arrest report. My children need stability, and the company cannot wait for your bureaucratic red tape," Gladdys snapped, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "Life must go on, and it will go on much faster once that claim is processed. Do not make me call your superiors." Christopher watched as she practically vibrated with the need to touch the money, his death reduced to a series of zeros on a digital balance sheet. He muttered to himself, "They're eating my flesh while I'm still breathing," his voice a ghost of the power he once held. The camera feed flickered, switching to the boardroom where his son, Alex, was engaged in a much more violent dismantling of the Udo legacy. Alex stood at the head of the table, leaning over Barrister Ojo, the family's longtime lawyer who had helped Christopher build his first real estate development. The young man's face was flushed, his designer tie loosened as he slammed a stack of documents onto the polished marble. "Listen to me carefully, Ojo," Alex growled, his voice echoing through the speakers in Christopher's hiding spot. "I don't care about my father's ghost instructions. The company is bleeding confidence because the chair is empty. I want my name on every board account, and I want the power of attorney signed by the end of the business day." Ojo remained steadfast, his voice calm but strained. "Mr. Alex, your father's will is explicit. It cannot be read or executed for 30 days. These are legal safeguards he put in place to ensure a smooth transition." "Then maybe we need a new lawyer," Alex sneered, leaning into Ojo's personal space with a threatening glare. "The world is moving, and I will not let a dead man's paranoia stall my ascent." You either sign these authorizations, or I will ensure you never practice law in this country again." In the shadows of Imo State, Christopher watched his son, the boy he had mentored, the heir he had supposedly prepared, threatening an old man to steal what he hadn't yet earned. It was a feast of vultures, and as the clock ticked away the hours of his third day of death, Christopher realized that the family he had fought so hard to provide for was nothing more than a collection of strangers waiting for a payday. He sat up slowly, his voice heavy like thunder behind the clouds. "I gave them everything," he whispered, "and they've buried me alive." The transformation of the Udu mansion was now complete, shifting from a house of mourning into a headquarters for a silent coup. Inside the dimly lit executive suite of the estate, Gladdys sat in the oversized leather chair that had once been Christopher's throne, her fingers tracing the edge of a crystal glass. Across from her, Morris leaned over a set of brand-new branding mock-ups, his eyes alight with a cold, professional hunger. They weren't discussing the legacy Christopher had spent 40 years building, they were discussing its erasure. "Udu Real Estate Group sounds like a relic of the past," Morris murmured, sliding a sleek, minimalist logo across the desk. "It feels heavy, burdened by his shadow. We need something that reflects the new reign." Gladdys smiled, the light of the computer screen reflecting in her eyes like a predator in the dark. "Gladdys Global Holdings," she whispered, testing the weight of the name on her tongue. "Something that signifies the future, where the king is finally dead and the queen can breathe." They clinked glasses, a toast to a total rebranding that would effectively bury Christopher's name deeper than any casket could. While the corporate assassination was being plotted upstairs, the lower levels of the mansion erupted into a different kind of desecration. Sandra had turned the grand ballroom into a neon-lit stage for an influencer party, a gathering of the city's elite who cared more for lighting than for the man whose death had funded the champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive vapor and the thumping bass of music that rattled the frames of Christopher's ancestral portraits. "I swear," Sandra giggled, leaning into a group of friends as they filmed a live stream, "him dying was the best thing that ever happened to me. I was living in a cage before, no late nights, no freedom to travel to France whenever I wanted." She raised her phone, panning the camera across the opulent room to show off the jackpot she had just won, her laughter blending with the artificial joy of the crowd. Seeking a more authentic backdrop for a high-fashion selfie, Sandra slipped away from the noise and into the heavy silence of Christopher's private study. She draped herself over his desk, wearing his vintage gold wristwatch and holding a flute of champagne, posing for the lens in the very chair where he had once made the deals that secured her future. As she shifted her weight to find the perfect angle, her heel caught on a hidden latch beneath the desk. A secret drawer clicked open, and a small black digital recorder rolled out onto the carpet. Confused, Sandra picked it up, her thumb grazing the play button. The exuberant noise of the party in the hallway seemed to vanish as a voice, cold, clear, and unmistakably her father's, filled the room. "This is Christopher Udu," the recording began, vibrating with a quiet, terrifying intensity. "If you are hearing this, I am not dead. I am watching. And everything you have done, I have recorded." Sandra froze, the champagne flute slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The color drained from her face as she looked at the dark corners of the room, suddenly feeling the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes. Miles away in Imo State, Christopher watched her through the screen, his lips tightening into a grim, dark smile. "Let the fear begin," he whispered to the empty room, watching as his daughter's world started to crumble before she had even begun to spend his fortune. The tension in the Udu mansion reached a suffocating peak on the Sunday afternoon of the grand memorial service. The living room was a sea of black lace, dark agbatas, and flickering white candles, as the city's elite, church elders, and grieving relatives gathered to bid a final farewell to a man they believed had moved on to the ancestral realm. A massive portrait of Christopher Udu sat draped in silk, the words "gone too soon" emblazoned across a giant ribbon. Gladdys stood at the front, a picture of saintly sorrow, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief as a pastor began to drone on about Christopher's legacy. Sandra hid behind oversized sunglasses, her fingers twitching with the urge to check her crypto balance, while Alex paced near the window, his mind already calculating the board seats he intended to seize by morning. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors creaked open, and a blast of cold wind swept through the hall, causing the candle flames to dance violently. The pastor's voice faltered. One by one, heads turned toward the entrance, where a tall figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He was dressed in a pristine white caftan, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes burning with a sharp, terrifying clarity. It was Christopher. A collective gasp tore through the room. Chairs scraped against the marble as guests recoiled in horror. Someone screamed that the dead had risen, while an elderly aunt fainted where she stood. Christopher stepped forward, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows in the sudden, deafening silence. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of thunder. "I heard you were all praying for my soul. It seems I arrived just in time to answer those prayers myself." Gladdys dropped to her knees, her face a mask of ashen terror as she stammered, asking if he was a ghost. Christopher looked down at her, his expression devoid of the love he had once carried. "I am alive, Gladdys. And I am profoundly disappointed." When Alex tried to speak of a miracle, Christopher raised a hand for silence and pulled a small remote from his pocket. With a single click, the hidden projector on the wall flickered to life, and the memorial service transformed into a courtroom of truth. The guests watched in stunned silence as high-definition footage played. Gladdys toasted to her freedom with Morris, Sandra listed her father's watches for sale while mocking his memory, and Alex threatened their lawyer to bypass his father's will. The betrayal was laid bare in vivid detail, stripping away the family's lies before the very eyes of the society they sought to impress. Christopher turned to the crowd, his voice rising with a lion's authority. "This is the family I built. They didn't mourn me, they tried to catch my spirit so they could bury it faster." As the room erupted into chaos, Christopher stood at the center of the storm, no longer a victim, but a man reborn with fire. The atmosphere in the grand hall turned from a spectacle of shock into a cold, clinical execution of justice as Christopher Udo stood among the wreckage of his family's reputations. The guests, once mourners, were now witnesses to a total dismantling of the Udo bloodline. Gladdys remained on the floor, her red-lipped mouth agape, while Sandra and Alex stood frozen, their faces drained of the arrogance that had fueled their 3-day feast of greed. Christopher did not look at them with anger. He looked at them with the detached finality of a man closing a book he should have never opened. "I gave you life," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers of the crowd like a blade. "And in return, you tried to catch my spirit and bury it before it could even rot." He turned to Barrister Ojo, who stood ready with a fresh leather-bound folder. "The will you held was a test," Christopher announced, "and today, I have signed the final amendment." He reached into the shadows behind him, beckoning a young man forward. It was Toby, the quiet, respectful grandson of Auntie Mary, the housemaid who had cleaned the Udo mansion for decades. Toby stepped into the light, dressed in a simple, clean blue caftan, his eyes wide with a mixture of humility and fear. The room erupted in a second wave of gasps as Christopher placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "From this moment, Toby is my sole legal heir," Christopher declared, his voice booming with authority. "He is the only one who gave me love without a price tag, the only one who cleaned my shoes while you were busy trying to step on my heart." He handed Toby the brown envelope containing the deeds to the empire, the real estate, the bank accounts, and the very roof over their heads. The retribution was swift and merciless. Outside, a fleet of moving trucks, already approved by a court order, pulled into the driveway, their arrival timed with the precision of a military strike. Christopher looked at Gladdys, Sandra, and Alex, his expression as hard as the marble floors they were about to lose. "You have 2 hours," he said coldly. "Pack what you can carry, but do not touch a single item bought with my sweat." The transition from billionaires to outcasts happened before the sun could set. Christopher watched from the balcony as Gladdys, her wig crooked and her eyes smudged with genuine tears of loss, stood barefoot in the driveway next to a pile of mismatched bags. Sandra and Alex stood behind her, defeated and disowned, their designer phones now useless as their accounts were frozen to the last kobo. They were sent away from the luxury of the estate to a derelict property in Porthacourt, a world away from the life they had tried to steal. As the black SUV carrying the new heir pulled through the gates, Christopher rolled up the window, leaving his former family to the silence of the streets they had long forgotten. The boardroom of the Udu Group Tower was a vault of glass and polished marble, a space where loyalty was usually measured in profit margins and years of service. Toby sat at the head of the long table, the leather of Christopher's chair creaking softly beneath him, but the air in the room was as cold as a tomb. 12 men, who had worn bespoke suits longer than Toby had worn shoes, stared at him with eyes that dripped with condescending pity. The head of logistics, a man who had built his career on Christopher's favor, cleared his throat with a sharp, mocking sound. "Mr. Toby," he began, his voice laced with a fake, oily smile, "one must admit that leading a multi-billion naira real estate empire is not a skill one picks up while delivering firewood or cleaning shoes." A ripple of suppressed laughter moved around the table, a sound of sharks circling a fresh carcass. Toby's heart hammered against his ribs, but he remembered Christopher's words about wealth revealing one's true nature. He looked at the board members, his gaze steadying even as his hands remained hidden beneath the table to mask their trembling. While Toby faced the psychological warfare of the corporate elite, a more sinister plot was being forged in the shadows of a low-lit bar. Gladdys, stripped of her titles and her luxury, sat across from a man whose eyes were as dark and hollow as his conscience. His name was Joshua, an ex-con and a master of digital destruction. Gladdys slid an envelope across the stained table, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. "I want his reputation burned to the ground," she hissed, the sound like a snake in the grass. "I want the world to see him as a fraud, a thief, and a village boy who stumbled into a palace he doesn't deserve." Joshua opened the envelope, the sight of the cash making him smile a jagged, predatory grin. He promised Gladdys that by the time he was done, Toby would wish he had stayed in the village, crawling back in shame under the weight of a national scandal. Back in the boardroom, Toby finally found his voice, a quiet strength emerging from the mockery. "You are right, sir," he said, leaning forward until his shadow fell over the logistics head. "Loyalty isn't taught in boardrooms, and neither is the truth." He pulled out a folder of his own, one that Christopher had prepared to help him navigate the den of lions. As he began to speak of audits and side deals, the laughter died in the throats of the men across from him. But even as Toby won his first battle for respect, the digital fire Joshua had ignited was already beginning to spread, a web of lies designed to destroy the new king before he could even settle into his throne. The digital storm broke with the sudden violent force of a tropical gale. Within hours, the carefully orchestrated character assassination prepared by Joshua began to flood the nation's social media feeds, turning the name Toby into a hashtag of national disgrace. Forged emails, expertly doctored voice notes, and grainy manipulated videos surfaced on every major news blog, painting a picture of a village boy who had secured his inheritance through bribery and the systematic manipulation of an aging billionaire. The narrative was seductive and toxic, a fake CEO, a puppet of corruption, and a tribalist who looked down on the very people he now led. By midday, the virtual outrage spilled onto the physical streets. A mob of hired protesters and genuinely misled citizens gathered outside the gates of the Udu Group HQ, their placards demanding that Toby be fired and the empire return to the rightful heirs. Inside the executive boardroom, the same directors who had only recently begun to respect Toby now turned on him with the predatory instinct of a wounded pack. "This scandal is burning our stock prices to ashes, Toby," the head of finance shouted, his fist rattling the marble table. "Christopher made a mistake. You are a liability we can no longer afford." Toby sat at the center of the shouting, his face pale and his hands trembling, but his eyes were fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop. He wasn't looking at the insults or the trending lies. He was watching a tracer program that an IT officer, acting on Christopher's quiet instructions, had embedded into the metadata of the original leaks. The air in the room seemed to thin as a small blinking red dot appeared on a digital map of the city. Toby raised his hand, a gesture of unexpected authority that silenced the bickering board members. He turned the screen toward them, revealing a satellite view of a low-lit, nondescript bar on the outskirts of Lagos. "The fire that is burning this company wasn't started by a village boy," Toby said, his voice steadying with a cold, righteous anger. It was started from this IP address, registered to a business owned by Gladdys Udo. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow, the directors' faces shifting from indignation to a stunned, uncomfortable silence. Even as the shouts of the protesters outside grew louder, Toby looked out the window at the chaos his stepmother had bought with her last remaining coins. He realized then that real leadership wasn't about the applause of the crowd, but about the fire required to burn away the lies. Christopher, watching from the shadows of his office, gave a slight, proud nod. The test was almost over, but the final strike, the truth of Toby's blood, was yet to be unleashed upon a world that had tried to bury him in shame. The day of the final reckoning arrived under the blinding glare of 1,000 camera flashes in the Okonkwo Group auditorium. Toby walked onto the stage not with the hesitation of a servant, but with the steady, quiet fire of a man who had already survived the worst his enemies could throw. He stood behind the podium, dressed in a simple black kaftan that mocked the designer suits of the board members who had recently called for his head. "I was born in a one-room basement in Onitsha," Toby began, his voice amplified across the nation's airwaves. "My first job was to clean shoes, to be invisible, to be mocked. I have been lied about before, but what surprised me was not the lie, it was who bought it." With a sharp nod, Toby signaled for the screens behind him to ignite. The auditorium fell into a deathly silence as the unedited investigative footage played, tracing every forged email and manipulated video directly back to Gladdys' bar in Lagos and her payment to the hacker Joshua. The crowd gasped as the truth stripped away the scandal, but the final blow was yet to come. A second screen flickered to life, revealing Christopher Udo himself. "I built this empire with my hands," Christopher's voice boomed, steady and heavy like thunder. "But my family betrayed me. Only one person stood by me for love, not money. I name him my son, not just in my will, but in my heart. Toby is my biological son, a legacy I will never regret again." The room erupted into a deafening roar of applause and tears as the firewood boy was revealed to be the true blood of the king. Journalists jumped to their feet as the internet flooded with the news of the nation's new hero. Outside, the very crowds that had protested now danced and cheered Toby's name. Later that night, Toby stood on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the city he had once walked through barefoot. Christopher joined him, a proud smile on his face, knowing the crown had finally found a worthy head. While the mansion glowed with new life, miles away in a derelict hotel, Gladdys sat on the edge of a stained mattress, watching the triumph on a cracked phone screen. She was alone, powerless, and forgotten by the society that had once bowed to her. She threw the phone across the room and screamed into the empty night, but no one answered. Back under the stars, Toby stood tall, no longer a servant or a secret, but the king they could no longer reach.